Aldrin Sampear. Is it the jacket that gives it away? I think it's because you were chatting to him a little bit earlier on. But there has been this reaction across political parties, and I guess the DA at the front of it because of the actions, the legal processes that they've taken to get to this point.
Well, certainly, even if you look on social media at the moment, Spytapes, #Spytapes is still trending, and you know we stem back with this matter all the way since 2003. Bulelani Ngcuka, then NPA head, deciding not to prosecute President Jacob Zuma, although he mentioned that there's a prima facie case against President Jacob Zuma, and this is where we're at the moment. And as you've mentioned, that the DA has been fighting this matter, trying to get President Jacob Zuma to be prosecuted. They've also indicated that about 30 million rand has been used so far, and Musimamani and them are clear that President Jacob Zuma should have his day in court. Whether or not that will happen is something that we'll have to watch quite closely, but the Supreme Court of Appeal has indicated that the High Court ruling is upheld, which means that President Jacob Zuma must face those charges. Let's just quickly bring into this conversation Professor Dirk, who joins us all the way from Pretoria. Good evening, Professor. We were together this morning watching the judgment, and now we have the full judgment that is out, and quite interesting looking at the judgment, speaking about raising concerns, rather, about how President Jacob Zuma's legal team got a hold of these so-called spy tapes.
Yes, that is indeed so. That is a matter that was raised earlier on, but I think the fact that it has been raised now officially by the Supreme Court of Appeal carries more weight. And I think that is something which they just can't ignore. And it played a very important role in the decision of 2009, obviously, and therefore it is something that has to be revisited, because it's also a reflection on the role that the intelligence agencies played in this matter, and to what extent they've actually been pulled into it by the two main political players from 2007 onwards, or even before that. We know that in some of the other judgments earlier on, there were some comments made about the role that they played.
And something quite that really boggles the mind is this coincidence that you have the Supreme Court of Appeal saying that law enforcement agencies using state resources to spy on each other, and then you have this what is now being referred to as a dodgy intelligence report to get Pravin Gordhan fired. These two coincidences quite interesting and quite intriguing.
Yes, that's indeed so. And added to that is also now that reference to the KPMG report, which is, some would argue, is played a very important role in the indictment of President, before he was president, but today's President Zuma also. So it opens up and complicates the matter tremendously, the fact that there are now external factors to some extent that is now going to play a role. But I think what we've seen with this judgment of today is that it narrows down the options. It says that, for example, the motive that was behind the indictment of President Zuma is irrelevant. Whether McCarthy or whether the Bulelani Ngcuka had some specific political plans, all of those were ultimately not relevant for the decision about whether President Zuma must be prosecuted or not. So I think these aspects that President Zuma's legal team is now trying to put on the table is obviously there in order to complicate or to make the situation more complex, to win to some extent some time, also maybe create reasons for them to review decisions that will be made in future. But at the same time, I think if there's a direct interpretation of what we've heard today, then those matters should not become complicating factors.
I wonder, though, whether, because President Jacob Zuma's counsel has indicated in their press release this afternoon that President Jacob Zuma would have some sort of interest in making representation on the basis of the KPMG report and Johan van der Walt being discredited through the rogue unit, the SARS rogue unit report, whether that will have any bearing, considering that Judge Hilary Squires already made a judgment that found Schabir Shaik guilty of corruption, and it was based on that judgment that the NPA decided to prosecute President Jacob Zuma. Does that have any bearing whatsoever if President Jacob Zuma does get an opportunity to make representation and argue that that report cannot be used anymore because Johan van der Walt has been discredited?
Yes, well, that's one way of interpreting. Mine will be a more direct one, and that is to say the Hawks and ultimately the NPA must take responsibility for the investigation and formulating the indictment. Whatever they are going to use is there in order to support them, but ultimately they must take responsibility for the investigation. So it is not KPMG or any other auditing company or any other private investigation or intelligence group or whatever that they can rely on, or to say, to divert the attention away and say, but these institutions are not reliable, or they are not part of this, it's not an organ of state and therefore cannot be used. Ultimately the buck stops with the Hawks as the investigating unit and the NPA as the prosecution agency. And therefore it depends on what is the evidence that they present to the court, and that is where it stops. Nothing else, whether it's KPMG or any other institution.
Just before I let you go, very, very quickly, is there any precedent when it comes to prosecuting a sitting head of state that you know of?
We are one of the few countries in the world, no, not the way in which President Zuma might be prosecuted, because most countries in the world have what they call presidential immunity. So it means that incumbent sitting presidents cannot be prosecuted, they can only be prosecuted afterwards. Now we have a number of presidents who will be prosecuted afterwards. For example, President Chirac of France, the Prime Minister of Italy not long ago, Berlusconi, has been prosecuted also, but not while they were in office. So our situation where it is possible, legally and constitutionally possible, to prosecute incumbent sitting president is a very unique situation.
Well, certainly. Thank you so much. There you have it from Dirk Kotze, Professor Dirk Kotze, joining us all the way from Pretoria. Quite an interesting one. Many questions being asked. First of all, can you prosecute a sitting head of state? And another question that many people have been raising on social media, and I guess there's a lot of cynicism that comes from this one, is whether South Africa has an extradition treaty with the EA.
Dubai.